Hello, everyone. This is John Zorn, Executive Director of ArtsReach, and welcome to our webinar today. We are holding this series of webinars because we aren't able to do conferences right now. Unfortunately, there's no secret panacea to the current problems that everyone is facing, but there is a lot we can do to get ready for when our campaigns will be in full swing again. So, from the comfort of your own home office, please sit back and enjoy this webinar by Doug McLennan, the editor of ArtsJournal. And if you have questions for Doug, please type them into the question box and send them in, and we will take care of all of your questions, or as many as we can, at the end of Doug's presentation. So, Doug, take it away.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, John. Hope everybody can hear me. There are so many things to be said about the situation we found ourselves in right now. And as I started putting this together, I realized that any number of topics deserve full discussion by themselves. But what I wanted to do today was to give a broad overview. And then at the end, we can focus more specifically on things you're interested in, just to ask some questions. But just a note here, take note of my email address on this first slide and write it down. And at the end, there are more things that you'd like to follow up in the coming weeks. Email me and I'll create new presentations focusing on other things if there's interest. I'm also thinking if there's enough interest about starting a weekly something, an email, podcast, maybe whatever, form to be decided later that will give updates and ideas and analysis of what's happening. If you're interested in signing up, just send me a quick email. And I see that there are more than 400 people signed up for this call today. So I may not be able to get back to everyone, but I'll try. So today's talk will last about 30 minutes if I don't get sidetracked. And then we'll take questions. It's very odd to be doing these webinars because you can't see anybody, so you can't tell how people are reacting to what you say. So I find it agony, but I'm told by others that the fact that they can just put it on in background makes it easy to do. We're all tired of the Zoom thing where you have to pretend to look interested. So anyway, I've broken this down into 3 parts, where we are, what we know, and then looking forward. And each one, I think, will be about 10 minutes. So what just happened? An explosion, obviously, and everything has changed. Everything that was the way we thought it was has now been thrown up in the air, and there's an awful lot of carnage, an awful lot of damage out there. And that is both catastrophic, but it's also gives us some interesting opportunities. And you know, I say this in my other talks, but you know, it's easy to have values when nobody is challenging those values. When something big happens, something difficult happens, something terrible happens, your values are tested. And that's where we actually really come through with our values. So it's been very interesting in the last few weeks to see the assertion of values, those who said they believe certain things, and you can see by their behavior it's not true, and those who really step in and do astonishing things. So on ArtsJournal, we have been, of course, chronicling all of this. We look at about 1,000 stories a day, and of course there were at the beginning just nothing but loss and grief stories, things shutting down, catastrophic stories. But we very quickly shifted from that to a lot of very interesting ways that artists are adapting quickly, and it's going at enormous speed. So you can see it in front of your eyes. So if you're looking for ideas of what you can do in your organization or how others are adapting to this and creating new art forms, creating new ways of coping with things. Every day we've got, a dozen stories at least kind of talking about how things are adapting in organizations and artists talking to their communities or with their communities. The numbers so far, and we just sort of got to get through this for a second. The study, first study to come out was Americans for the Arts, and they predicted a collective $4.5 billion. That was as of April 8th. So that was, probably looking back 2 weeks ago. So the damage to the arts industry is probably on the order of over $1 billion a week. So there's devastation everywhere. The response to it has been kind of interesting. The first stimulus package, bailout package Congress put together had about $300 million for the arts, including $75 million for the NEA, which is just a drop in the bucket. The foundations, what few foundations we have now supporting the arts, national foundations, also got together and put together a number of artist relief funds, and some of the biggest got together and put together a $75 million fund. You start seeing stories like New York and its arts industry, which is one of its prime attractions, really suffering in this. Stories about perhaps the Met Opera won't make it through this with its $300 million budget. I'm not sure that's true. It will survive in some form. But certainly the scale of what we're talking about is so enormous that $75 million thrown into the breach is, quickly engulfed. So that may save some of these organizations for a little while, but this is probably going to go on for a while, and we're going to have to adapt in other ways. There's some interesting things about messaging. Wait, I went too far through here. Okay. Messaging in this is, how do you message your organization? The New York Philharmonic put out a thing saying, in our 178-year history, the New York Philharmonic has weathered the US Civil War, 2 world wars, and survived the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. We will be back. My email box is flooded with arts organizations saying, please help us, we're in danger of going away. Everybody is affected by this. And so the question about how do you position yourself with your community when everybody is out there looking for support for what they do, the focus on the community that you serve is every bit as much as important as the please help us to survive message. One of my favorite examples of this was the Vermont National Guard. It turns out is made up largely of the 40th Army Military Band. And when they were called up, they were asked to create a hospital, which they did in about 4 days. They created one of those pop-up hospitals. And the captain, the commander of the brigade basically said, because they were used to playing together in an orchestra, they knew about collaboration. They were able to put everything together very quickly. So I think the world is dividing itself quite quickly right now, and this is an oversimplification, of course, but into the restorationists and the opportunists. The restorationists believe essentially that this is a really terrible, terrible thing. We have to get through this by whatever means, but things will return to normal and we can get back to doing what we do. The opportunists take a look at this and go, everything has changed. How can we take advantage of these changes and evolve the things that we believe in and create something new? And that's a very important kind of distinction, because the scale of what it is that we're looking at here is basically a tsunami. You know, if the Mellon Foundation spent every last penny of its billions of dollars of endowments to try and save the arts sector through this, it would be washed away, and the Mellon Foundation would be extinct at that point. So then the difficult conversation has to be is, do we throw a lot of resource at things which aren't going to make it, or do we think about what can we save, or better yet, what could we actually build in the face of this? That's a very different conversation, but it's the conversation I think that's going to be essential, because, you know, when you look at trying to restore things, you know, that small amount of money to the NEA, the $75 million, was just a drop in the bucket, but already you had an awful lot of people saying this was an insane waste of money. Why are we wasting money on the arts? And the arts lobbyists, Americans for the Arts and others, have tried very hard to make the case about what the essential industry is and how many jobs and you know, all the good things that the arts contributes, but those arguments are not really going to make much headwind with people who just essentially don't believe in the values of them. So I prefer to look at it like this. You know, we have a puzzle that looked like something like this, and this next slide here, and it had order to it. We fit all the pieces of the puzzle together. Then along came this thing, and we went to this, which is a jumble up. Right now, all the puzzle pieces are up in the air. The way things work are all up in the air. And where they reassemble is going to be interesting. What the event has kind of shown us, I think the fundamental lesson has been that the infrastructure that underpins all sectors of our society, whether it's our medical system, whether it's our education system, whether it's our road system, all of those things were actually impoverished. We haven't taken care of them for a long time. The infrastructure has been a mess for a long time. It's just that we haven't seen it. And on top of that, we have been involved in a lot of issues over time, like equity issues, incarceration issues, social justice issues, even healthcare for all, which have been intractably stuck. The sides have hardened, tiny bit of progress here, tiny bit of progress there, but then we lose things like the EPA and care of the environment and all of those things. So they're basically kind of stuck. But the kinds of conversations that were stuck even 6 months ago, the kinds of things now that you can actually talk about would have been unimaginable then. You know, when healthcare for all is a moral issue that doesn't speak to a certain sector of the political firmament. But when suddenly healthcare is a public safety issue and people not having healthcare, or millions losing their healthcare because they've lost their jobs, it moves it away from being a moral issue to a practical issue. We saw this with incarceration, where as long as we were saying that having too many people wrongly incarcerated was a moral bad, we didn't get anywhere. As soon as it was, wow, this costs an enormous amount of money to keep people in prisons, suddenly there was movement on it and actually progress to it. So everything is sort of jumbled up here. And I would suggest that our cultural infrastructure has been just pathetic for years, right? This is a real job thing up there. You know, the ability for artists to make a living has detached from the ability to sell content, by which I mean, as soon as content ended up being, you used to be able to get, or you're able to get a lot of content for free, it detaches from the ability to sell lots of content to actually be able to support yourself, right? So in the traditional model, which we've continued following, the more popular something is, the more people would buy something. Now that has detached and people don't have to buy it to be able to access it. So the business model that we've been following has been broken for a long time. So why would we try and restore a model which doesn't work? You know, the nonprofit model was created in the mid-60s as a way of generating capital for the cultural sector. And for a while it did a good job, but it has been insufficient for a long time. And there's insufficient capitalization of most of our artistic infrastructure in this country. So to go back to what we had is, you know, perhaps feels like it would be more comfortable, but that's just a wasted opportunity. You know, equity issues, we've been talking about equity for a long time. Well, when all the rules are now scrambled and the puzzle pieces are up, we can have a very different conversation about what equity looks like, both in our sector and the larger culture. And then finally, you know, the technology that should support the cultural industries has just been terrible. You know, I do a lot of traveling. I go to cities. I always look, you know, what's on tonight. Do you know how hard it is to find out what's going on? We have not invested in that. I love the fact that there are live streams everywhere right now. How are people accessing it? Mostly from word of mouth from their social media feeds and friends. But if you go and purposely look for, what are all the streams that are happening right now? It's very difficult. The League of Orchestras, the theater, TCG, a number have tried to put together lists, Musical America, of streaming feeds right now, but they're lists. They're clunky. They're difficult. The fact that we haven't attended to the technology to be able to support our sector is a huge scandal, and we need to do something about it. Now, as I said earlier, this is not just a problem in the arts. I read this morning that half of all daycare facilities are probably going to go out of business, right? The movie industry thinks that it won't have a profitable movie for the rest of this year. The whole medical system has changed and is going to have to be rethought. Higher education. You know, we spent 3 decades building very expensive buildings and infrastructure, and the actual delivery of the education itself went from, you know, tenured faculty who had an investment in teaching to adjuncts who get paid nothing and are not really you know, incentivized to look at the bigger picture of what your education is, right? So now we've encumbered hundreds of thousands of people with unsustainable student debt, and the quality of the education has not substantially improved. Well, we're learning all sorts of things about distance learning, and in some ways how that's better for some things, though not for all things. So what's going to happen to all these expensive buildings? What's going to happen to tuitions? How are we going to actually reform our education system? Again, an essential reform that needed to happen for a long time, but hasn't until now. That may be a different conversation. Transportation is the same. You know, why are people going to have to go into work for a lot of jobs every day? It actually turns out you can be more productive at home for a lot of those people. Well, then that has implications for commercial real estate, has implications for licensing of red tape for a lot of professions where things have been limited. So in every single sector, we have the opportunity to rethink things. And my concern is that many sectors are well equipped to position themselves to be incentivized and recover a new business model out of this. The arts tend to, because we're also involved in struggling just to keep things open, we don't look at things systemically enough. And my concern is that, as happened after 2009 with the financial meltdown, when things started to reassemble again, those who were comfortable and not terribly threatened by the financial meltdown essentially recognized opportunities, invested, and became that much richer. Those other sectors, like the arts sector, just struggling to survive, many cases never recovered since 2009. And the same thing could happen again if we don't think about being a little more intentional about what are the structures that we need to be able to thrive better in the larger culture. So a lot of thinking right now going on about what should be saved and what shouldn't, what helps and what doesn't help. Newspapers, for instance, journalism, this is a disaster. They're getting more audience, as is the arts, through this, but there's no advertising, and so the business model has collapsed. So local newspapers all over this country, there's going to be a die-off, so this extinction event for all middle-sized newspapers and lower. This is a catastrophe, I think, for local communities everywhere. But this is the same thing that potentially awaits the arts. So we need to think about some new models for the arts, because some things are just ultimately going to be different going forward. Theaters, for instance, the latest research shows that people are not going to be eager anytime soon to be crowding into theaters. Maybe a year. 6 months to a year was the most often answer to the question, will you go back to the theater again? When things do go back and we start programming theaters and museums again, there are going to be other outbreaks, which means that there's unpredictability, which means it's very difficult to plan. If you got a season that depends on X dates, it may be that even at the last minute, those dates are not possible. So being in the physical space as your primary or only strategy for talking to your community or interacting with your community is not going to be a winning strategy going forward. This is that survey about the reluctance to go into theater. There have now been a few of those. So I want to start looking at kind of how we're evolving kind of online. I always look at what are the people with money doing? And in this case, it's the late night network talk shows, right? They took a couple of weeks off, then came back, and they're broadcasting from their basements and their attics and their whatever. And if you've watched any of these, the opening monologues are actually kind of painful to watch because they depend on the timing of the crowd. They depend on the trappings and the sort of slick music and the interaction and all of that. And so it's very obvious what works with these shows and what doesn't work with these shows. Some of them seem to be finding their legs, and others it's just kind of hopeless. But it's interesting to see how they evolve. Given, you know, it's interesting to ask, with all of the resources that an NBC or a CBS has, why would they choose to do something so low-techy, low-quality, basic kind of thing? Because they could recreate studios in these people's homes and run them remotely, and they would look a little bit different from what they did, but you know, it would be similar. It's a conscious choice. The conscious choice is that in YouTube, in the beginning, the grainy quality, the handheld quality, the homemade quality is thought to be authentic. And so they're banking on this idea of the authenticity, even though they have all the resources in the world. What you're going to see at a certain point as we get out of this moment is that it becomes slicker and slicker. We are, you know, this was this big concert, global concert last weekend, which attracted tens and tens of millions of people. Again, very sort of low-tech produced, on purpose produced that way, because they wanted it to have that kind of authenticity to it. But everybody is going online. You know, the Rotterdam Philharmonic was one of the first, got 2.5, 3 million views for having its orchestra play their instruments from home. And people were wild about it. The Philadelphia Orchestra played Beethoven in front of an empty hall, and it was very moving. And so those things fit the moment. But now everybody is doing it, and the live streams and the kind of split screen Zoom performances of things are starting to look very, very familiar, and kind of all the same. And what you start to see is that the numbers of people watching them have declined into the hundreds and maybe thousands if they're lucky. Some, like the Paris Opera Ballet, start with filming dancers at home in their apartments. But by the end of the video, you start to see things that they do, visual tricks, which they wouldn't be able to do on a stage. And this is the first glimmer of thinking about the web and this medium as its own medium, right? Here's the, you know, you start to see them do performances in ways that that are more native to the web. Now, where does this come from? So for decades, the Metropolitan Opera televised operas from Lincoln Center live on PBS, right? Okay, sort of interesting, but kind of boring. What it was, the problem was that it was a facsimile of what you would see in the stage. It was, in other words, second best to the stage. It was something that was familiar to people, but clear you weren't there, clear that it wasn't in any way a better experience other than the fact that you could sit in front of your television set at home and not have to go out. But the revolution was when the Met decided to go on its HD Live and broadcast into theaters. And they didn't just capture the stage version, they rethought the form and hired cinema directors, movie directors, great movie directors, who imagined the visual style of this in ways that, cinematic ways, which we're all much more familiar. You know, if you think about it, most of our experience with artists these days is mediated through screens and technology of some sort. We listen to way more music through our headphones than we actually hear live. We watch much more television and video on our screens than we're actually in the theater watching a play, right? So these forms themselves have their own visual language, have their own media language, and we're comfortable with that language. In fact, I've argued for a long time that one of the problems is that when your visual language that we recognize on screen is different from the language on the stage, people have to learn that stage language, and a lot of people aren't comfortable with that. It's true that the screen language came from the stage and storytelling came from the stage, but over the years it's evolved into fast cuts and close-ups and angles and all of that stuff. So a lot of people now are more comfortable, in fact, seeing things on a screen than they are on a stage. And so you make an asset of the medium in which you're working. And that's really important. So you're saying, okay, well, I don't have the resources to be able to do that. Well, the good news is that there are all sorts of people out there to help you both think through the way to do it, and actually the cost of doing it now is actually pretty cheap. So there are a number of resources out there. The other aspect of this is not just getting content out, because again, we have to figure out how to pay for it. And we also want to interact with our community in ways that isn't just about entertaining them, but building a community. And so we're starting to see some interesting experiments, for instance, in comedy right now, where people will do stand-up and behind them will be the audience, split in 100 different Zoom screens, reacting in real time to what the comic is saying, right? It's a kind of interesting experience. Or you see something like this where they're creating a comedy bit, but it's going back and forth. That they're using the medium in ways that they can charge for, and comics themselves are selling subscriptions, that are selling tickets to shows, etc. So there are some beginning efforts to do that. Excuse me. The granddaddy of all of this is gaming, video gaming, and sports betting, frankly. These are, this is from Fortnite, and, it has hundreds of millions of viewers. And what they're paying to do is to watch this guy live on the lower left of the screen here, play his way through this game. And on the right, they're chatting, they're forming communities, they're commenting on what he says, he's interacting with them, they're going back and forth. Now, it's video gaming and it's not everybody's cup of tea, but the fact that these have aggregated, enormous audiences, people who want to be part of it, it's worth looking at what are the attractions there? What are people getting from watching some dude play a video game and being able to, say something about that, interact about that? These are, in every classic way of defining communities, this is a community of people who grows up around that. Where is the arts equivalent of that? Because, one of the really inspiring things in all of this is the number of videos that I've seen of artists collaborating and talking to each other in Zooms and whatever. And, it's clear that these are really tight-knit communities and that they care about things, that they have extraordinary skills. We don't do enough of the kind of performative aspect of the online experience, allowing the audience to have a piece of that, be interactive. And online, just as the movie theater experience of the Metropolitan Opera is its own medium, the screen experience, the virtual experience, is its own medium, and we need to experiment with where that goes. You know, there are lots of ways of doing this. Netflix has a new feature. It's actually not a Netflix thing. It's an extension on Chrome that allows you to sync watching a movie with a group of people in remote locations with a chat box on the side, so that you can actually chat with your friends and family and community around it. It's kind of a cool thing to do. So, you know, there's lots of innovation going. I will say that ultimately, though, art is a deeply personal, deeply experiential, deeply, I gotta say, physical experience of being able to experience something in physical space with physical members of your community. And ultimately, through all of this, if we're spending all this time on screens, and a lot of those things that these new skills we're developing on screens are going to continue with us, it actually comes down to that live experience. And how can you do things, even when we get back into the live experience, to draw people in from elsewhere, wherever they happen to be able to share the experience of being part of that. And I think that's the sort of interesting opportunity, is to be able to expand the audience and bring them into those spaces that we've already always inhabited. So that's the overview. There's almost every topic in there could have its own thing, lots of examples, lots of really inspiring, interesting things going on. So maybe we have time for a few questions.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. Just type those questions in and send them on in, and we're going to take care of them.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
And like as I said, if there's anything particular any of you want to know, or for us to focus on, or to do something in the future with, we're going to start doing a weekly kind of standalone newsletter outside of ArtsJournal that kind of deals with some of these issues, and perhaps some other presentations. So.
Okay. Has any company jumped into virtual reality theater? Let's see, where they put a camera facing the stage and people wear the virtual reality goggles to watch?
There was a lot of excitement about virtual reality, 5 or 6 years ago. There were a couple of theater companies in the UK that were experimenting with that, and letting the audience kind of mix their own experiences of the theater that they were seeing. VR kind of ran out of a lot of steam about 2 or 3 years ago. Interestingly enough, because there wasn't enough creative content for it. And the VR companies, while they could find some practical uses for it, for instance, mining or mapping mine shafts, or doing some education things, the early experiments in this were mostly with music. You could be part of the band, you could be part of the people on stage, walk around the people on stage that were performing. But a lot of that energy kind of got, the investment capital kind of gave up on it and went elsewhere. Most of the concentration in tech investment right now is in augmented reality, where you can look at something on a street or a stage, for that matter, and you can interpose information above it. You can look at a restaurant facade from the outside and see the menu, for instance. In performance, that would be cool if you could take a look at a character and call up on your glasses, who is this person, what's their history. You could embed all sorts of really interesting things. But I don't know of any, really significant kinds of experiments with that going on right now.
Okay. Could you address the value of small performance organizations in being instrumental in the recovery by offering flexibility to build confidence for audiences to feel comfortable assembling again? Does this seem logical to you?
Boy, that's a great question. And I think that's totally right. Things happen, and the traditional shakeout is that the really rich, really big organizations will do ultimately fine because nobody will let them fail. The really smallest of the small will do okay because they're nimble and they can reinvent themselves, and they didn't have a whole lot to lose in any way. It's always the groups in the middle that just get vanquished. The days of 2,500 people going into a concert hall, I think are over for 2 years. There will be a wave again of lockdowns in the fall. Most likely. Most of the projections that I've seen for the sports leagues is that really things won't, this next season is probably a washout. So they're trying to figure out how virtually to do it. So I think that while the bigger organizations have resources to try and think about this stuff, they're so stuck in the ways in which they deliver things and the ways in which they think about interacting that it's very difficult for them to reimagine those structures. So I think the small organizations are actually the best positioned to be able to come up with innovative things to coax people. You don't need 3,000 people. You could maybe do it with 50 people. If you can figure out what is the line between virtual and physical in the space, I've been saying for a couple of years, all of the big tech companies for the last couple of years have, you could plot them on a line in investing in that line between the physical world and the virtual world. How do we kick people from the virtual to the physical and from the physical to the virtual? And it's that going back and forth and how you do that, which is where they see the most potential. Well, if that's where all of the big tech investment is going, it seems logical to me to think about arts organizations doing that. And I think that a lot of the tech has gotten so cheap now. You can do multi-camera setups and capturing things that you do in a space for very, very cheap, even with phones, and mix it. Software is practically free now. There are all sorts of ways to experiment with this. I think the key will be get in quick, do it now while there's a lot of tolerance for experimentation, error, things that don't work, and evolve them. Because if you wait for it to harden into, here's the way we do this, then you're too late. And it's very difficult to pick up a community after that. So I would say, if you have an idea, go for it and throw it up. And if you don't like the look of it, then just bury it somewhere. But lots of experimenting right now. That's kind of the order of the day.
Any thoughts on adapting our live presentations for social distancing?
I was in a conversation the other day with a theater person who said, we got 1,000-seat hall. Most we're going to be able to have in there is 150 people. And, there's going to have to be seats between them. There's going to have to be distance between them. Maybe this will make the live attendance that much more, precious, right? The context of which you see something, if there's a, if everybody is distanced and that becomes part of the context, that's going to change what it is that you see on the stage. One thing we haven't talked about is all of the art that's now being made about the situation that we actually find ourselves in, distancing, not being together, safety, all of this goes up in the air. I think that the trend of companies getting out of their traditional performing spaces and going into adaptive spaces where the experience itself is specific to the thing that you're trying to present. In other words, I think the days of the routine, it's Thursday night, we're at the symphony and they're playing, fill in the blank. I think those days are over for a while, right? But now we have the opportunity to make everything an event, right? What's your first event going to be? What's your first thing that's going to happen when it's possible to do that again, right? Think about the specialness of that, right? The celebration of that, the ability for everybody to come together in whatever way again. That's a really powerful context to do something. You don't want to do something routine for that. You don't want to do something that's just another Thursday night at the symphony. You want to do something that celebrates the circumstance and the context in which you are. And if we start to think about the kinds of performances that we do as really specific and unique to the time and the place, the context and the situation that it's happening, I think that makes the performance experience that much more precious to people, because we're all tired of these damn screens. Zoom calls, why do they feel so exhausting? They're so exhausting because you're staring at a fixed point on the screen. All the screen culture that we can access, it's fabulous that we have the opportunity to do that, but it kind of scrolls by endlessly, and we're moved for 30 seconds until we find the next thing. So that celebration of people being able to get back together as part of their community and recognize themselves as part of that community, I think is a really powerful thing. And I think that small groups are who have that kind of grassroots relationship with their communities are going to be brilliant at this. You just have to figure out and be purposeful about what that's going to be.
You didn't address donors. How are donors being engaged the best?
So the whole donor question is, another huge topic. Obviously, everybody is being pushed to support whatever it is that they care for. Um, Obviously, a lot of people have lost their jobs and don't have the capacity to support organizations that they've been supporting for a while. I think that if you make it all about you, you've missed an opportunity, and also it's kind of obnoxious, frankly, at this point. I think it's this is the time at which, how do I serve this community? And I think that reasserting your value to people is what captures donors forever. You know, my dad used to tell stories about, he grew up in the Depression, and he tells stories about merchants who would help people. People who went out of their way to feed people who didn't have anything, or took children in because their parents couldn't take care of them. And for decades after, people supported them. He saw firsthand the Salvation Army in his city responded in just an amazing way. He had an encounter. And for the rest of his life, he supported the Salvation Army. That is like, man, you could not tell him anything about them. It's like they were, they came through for him. So I think how do you come through for your community? I saw there's a statement that the big arts lobbying groups have put together, lobbying Congress for more aid in this last thing, and the whole preamble to it was, the arts are essential, the arts are something we can't, blah, blah, blah. And it goes on about saying why the arts are important, and they should give the arts money. And in a way, I understand the need for that argument to be made, but I think you show rather than say. And I think that those organizations that are able to pivot right now, and so many arts organizations have become sort of cultural institutions which are about social justice, about helping communities, about making communities better. I think those organizations that show their real contributions and helping of those communities, that's where you start to capture donors for life. Because again, it's assertion of values, and people respond to values. And if it's just about, we need money to support ourselves, I'm sorry, that doesn't fly with the thousands of other requests I'm getting. But if if you're stepping in and doing something valuable, people will remember it forever.
All right. Do you have any suggestions for organizations that are venues rather than content creators?
That's a good one, because venues sort of are the problem, right? Right now, because we can't use venues because we can't be together, and venues are built as gathering places, and that's the last place you want to be right at the moment. It's not always going to be that, though. So how could you use your venue in ways that support the community, right? What's the food bank situation in your area? Is that something you could use your lobby to help with? What about testing? Look around at what your community needs, and there are all these pop-up hospitals, pop-up testing facilities, pop-up food banks, etc., that are helping. Is there a way that you can use space that you have, which is an asset, which is your currency? Is there a way that you can use that to help the community in some way, expecting nothing back? Is there a way that you can offer the facilities that you have to artists who could use it in limited ways while this is all shut down? Maybe not to use it for audiences, but maybe as a studio for doing their virtual something. You have a lot of assets as part of being a facility that right now you're not going to make any income anyway. So what would it be like to find ways to help as many people as you can using those assets to go forward?
Okay. Doug, we're getting towards the end of our hour, and of course, we've got tons more questions. So what about going for another 5 or 10 minutes and handling some of the questions that we have? Probably not all of them, but some of them. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so we're going to go for about another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, you have provided a really interesting overview of how arts have pivoted during this time. Do you have any further thoughts about the next 12 to 24 months as we bridge from the authentic but raw online content to perhaps returning to venues again? My thoughts are that there will be demand for quality online content that can fill the void until traditional content pipelines catch up.
Absolutely, and we're starting to see it. There's a band in Oakland that made a pretty interesting Zoom video the other day in which they used the sort of checkerboard faces of the band members to give the illusions of going back and forth in between the boxes, and kind of, it was edited. It wasn't a thing. Imagine if you had people you were connecting up and they had green screens behind it, and you could actually kind of make it look like they were part of a fantasy landscape, or a real landscape for that matter. I think if the first month or two is any indication, the sophistication of this, the language of this is going to, just, exponentially increase over the next couple of months. That's why I'm thinking that, for any performer, for any organization, for any venue going forward, you've got to factor in the virtual aspect of what it is that you do, right? There's the live space, yes. Maybe that's the premium space in some sort of, that you want to ultimately be part of. But you have the ability to aggregate, hundreds of thousands of other people into that space, and it is not the same experience as being in there, but it's a version of it for the version itself. In other words, the medium that captures it is a version of it online that works for online. It's not just pointing a camera at a stage, right? So I could see going forward, 24 months from now, we're back to semi-normal. We're holding performances, but maybe only in half-filled halls. In order to make it a viable proposition, we've got to then draw in another 1,000 people virtually online. Maybe we've created a membership that gives you access to whatever we do online, and then 1 or 2 physical in-person live experiences. I look back to the National Football League, and when they first started experimenting with televising games, the rule was that if the game was not sold out 72 hours before the actual game, then it couldn't be televised in the home city, right? It could be televised elsewhere, just not at home. And they realized after a few seasons that that was a really totally stupid thing to do, because unless you get fans who have an ongoing relationship with you, i.e. they're following you week to week, you're not going to be able to sell those really pricey tickets, right? And there are very few fans out there who can afford hundreds of dollars for a ticket, or thousands of dollars for a season of tickets. But they know if they get you hooked on watching on TV for free every week, you're interested in the team, and maybe once or twice a year, you'll buy a ticket. And that's what the business model is. And what it ultimately became is that they now make more money from television rights than they do for selling tickets. So it's largely a virtual business, right? So what's the arts version of that? I see that anybody as an artist out there, you used to write a book. You were an author, you're a solitary person, you sit in your room at home, you write the book, it goes to the publisher and it goes out. That's it. They promote it, they advertise it, whatever. You can't be an author today and be that kind of writer. You have to be promoting it out on social media. You have to be doing virtual book tours. You have to be out on the road doing readings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have to be a personality, right? Does that mean that that the old kind of writer who might not have done very well at this can't make a living? In some cases, that's actually true. The artists evolve given what the skills are required at the time. And the skills that were required up until February of this year to be a venue, to be an organization, to be an artist were one set of skills. Now we have to develop another set of skills, which means having a virtual persona, a virtual identity that works in such a way, not only artistically, but helps to feed the business model that allows you to do the work that you need to do. So I think some sort of integration is going to be necessary, no matter where this goes over the next 12 to 24 months. And I think, it's not going to be until 12 months, 24 months, where people are going to be comfortable gathering in large groups again. What are we going to do until then? We got to figure something out.
I think that's the next webinar, right, Doug?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the next question kind of gets at a zillion sort of logistical questions. So we'll just scratch the surface here with this question. How comfortable will artists on stage be, considering how close they must be on stage and backstage?
Okay, so practical considerations.
Right.
Okay, this is an important thing.
Uh-huh.
We're not going to be able to open up again and go back to semi-normal until we have massive testing of everybody, right? So it's going to be part of the routine when you go into your office that you stop at the door and you do a 10-minute test. You test for whether you're infected or not. And 10 minutes later, you get your results, you're cleared, and you go in. Likewise, if you're going to perform together, if you're going to work together, you're going to get tested. And that's how we're going to be safe. And when somebody turns up as they've been infected, then we'll contact trace people and we'll try and confine it. But there's going to be no version of normal that doesn't include the ability to figure out that people who are going to come into close contact with one another are going to be tested. So I'm assuming that before we get back to performing in groups again, that some version of that kind of easy testing is in place, and that's what we're doing.
Okay. Let's see. Is there a potential for smaller houses that are cherished by audiences, or will it only be for the wealthy who can afford selective experiences?
I think that's largely the product of how it is that you see yourself in your community. Again, it comes down to values, right? We got a problem. The problem is that we have to be able to pay for the things that we want to be able to do. The problem is compounded by the fact that if we only make it for wealthy people, then we're cutting off an enormous number of people from having access to the work that we want to do. So, but this is not anything different than we've had for a long, long time, right? It's always that balance between how do you pay for what you want to do, what's the ticket price going to be, and how is it that you're creating your community around that? You know, that there's this mistaken belief that isn't new right now, but it's been around for a long time, that the audience that we have is, boy, it's that audience and we can't lose them. Well, you know, you define the audience that you have. And if you want it to be just for rich people, then you're going to do things to make it that way. If you want a diverse audience, an audience of working people, of whatever, you have to design it that way. And you have to create the business model that does. These business models aren't set in stone, right? Just because it costs something to do something, and we have supported it this way, doesn't mean that's always going to be the case. You know, in the case of journalism, it's been ad supported, but the ads for a long time now have not fully supported what it is. So we've had a lot of failures in the journalism world, and a couple of publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Atlantic, a couple of others, they're now, you know, majority membership driven. And I know memberships in the museum world are, that's the kind of primary engagement with support in your community, but it's not so much in the performing arts world. So I think the way you support things is a product of the values that you want to put forward in the things that you do and the community that you build around it.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
This is a good one to finish on, I think. With regard to your statement about restorationists and opportunists, are you suggesting that only the opportunists will survive? If people will be hungry for direct human connection, will the restorationists also survive if they can hold out? Does theater have to change and adapt at its core to survive? Thanks for all your thoughts.
You know, theater has always had to adapt to survive, right? If we were still doing the same kind of theater for the same kind of audiences that we were doing back in the early 1900s, you know, it would look pretty odd to us right now. So, you know, these are living art forms that have always changed and always mutated and innovated and have become part of the product of their times. Now, I'm not saying I would be, you know, I'm a classical musician. I would be heartbroken if I couldn't hear a really good orchestra when I want to, you know. You know, and they're really expensive. The business model needs to be something else. So I'm not saying that these expensive institutions that are traditional, I want them to go away. No, I don't want them to go away. I want desperately to find a way for them to evolve into something better. Not necessarily something better artistically, although they may be different artistically, but something better in the sense of how they function in their communities and how they are able to support themselves, that isn't tied to strategies and, you know, realities of what the old, you know, pre-February 2020 world was like. And that's what gives me so much hope in all of this, is that, you know, with everything up in the air and everything on the table and nothing taken for granted anywhere in anything, the chance to kind of put this together in ways that are so much better, potentially, than what we had is a very exciting thing, or at least the prospect of being able to do that. I'm not at all confident that we'll figure that part out, but I do know that, you know, a number of the reforms that we've needed to make for a long time and have gotten nowhere with, suddenly people are open to talking about them because they see that there's possibility in that. And that doesn't mean just pitching aside symphony orchestras and, you know, big old theaters and, you know, all of that stuff. No, what it means is let's figure out a better place for them to be in the larger culture where they're valued, where they're supported, and where they're considered essential pieces of what the larger culture is.
Okay, well, we've gone way over. There's also a little bit of an explanation here, Doug. I think someone is telling us what that band was that you were referring to in Oakland. So if anyone's really curious about that, it's called Thou and the Get Down, Stay Down was the group, right. And Phenom was the song. So if you want to look that up, check it right out. Thou and the Get Down, Stay Down. There's a group for you. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to wrap up today's webinar. We will record it. Well, I take that back. We have recorded it, and we will send the recording out to everyone who has registered for the webinar today. So, Doug, it's always a pleasure to have you with us, whether in person or online. And thank you so much for your hard work and preparation and putting all this together. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.